building confidence index rose by 4 index points to a new four-year high of 41 points in the second quarter of the year. As a result of the increased building activity, sales and production of building materials were well supported. Joining us now to discuss this further is Sizwe Ngedlana, Chief Economist at FNB. Sizwe, thanks for your time. So, a little ray of light here. I mean, I'm taking positives such as this is a four-year high. We're also looking at the third consecutive quarter of an increase. The key question that then comes in, is this sustainable?
I think so, because this survey looks at the whole building pipeline, starting all the way from architects and quantity surveyors, including contractors, subcontractors, and also retailers and manufacturers of building materials. And in terms of the questions we ask about building activity in a forward-looking basis for the third quarter, profitability, etc., we are seeing respondents signaling an expectation that this gradual improvement is going to continue. Also, if you look further upstream in terms of quantity surveyors and architects, we are also seeing them not only reporting high levels of business confidence, but also reporting more projects at the sketching and planning stages. So I think from a low base, we are starting to see some nascent but sustainable improvement.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me is that you are noticing an improvement, but at the same time, you are also mentioning the fact that it is widespread.
Of course, and so if you look at the underlying subsectors that we survey, the overall confidence increased, but in terms of the underlying subsectors, the business confidence across the board also increased, whether it be architects, quantity surveyors, manufacturers, contractors and retailers of building materials. So that's what we mean by a broad-based underlying support for the overall confidence.
Yeah. So, Sizwe, what has changed here? What has ticked off this improvement? I do know that, of course, this sector has been under pressure since, if you like, going back to 2008, thereabouts. What has changed this time round?
Well, it seems that building activity, so the actual amount of work that respondents are reporting seems to be increasing, particularly in the residential space, although we are seeing some sort of increased activity levels being reported by contractors in the non-residential space. And I think that it's also reflective of the actual official data where we saw building activity in terms of building plans passed peak in 2007 and building completions peak in 2008. Over the last 4 odd years, we've seen significant contractions, but last year we started seeing evidence of building plans passed, for example, growing for the first time since 2007, and the rate of contraction in building completions also moderate quite significantly. So I think what this is telling us is that trend in the official building data is also likely to continue over the course of 2013.
Now, the interesting thing, of course, Sizwe, is to contrast this against the tepid job growth that we have seen. I mean, we just reported the numbers that came through a few minutes ago, where we were saying the economy created just 7,000 jobs, though there's been a steady creation of jobs that's been coming along. So it's not a robust sector, which places into question the sustainability as well as the strength of the recovery that we're seeing.
In terms of the building
industry, yes,
Well, look,
given residential to an extent is premised on a healthy consumer, if you like.
So if you look at the overall employment numbers, I think they are consistent with the overall moderation in the SA economy. If you look at my colleague Etienne's report last week in terms of the RMB BR Business Confidence Index. Out of the surveyed sectors, 4 actually declined. Construction is the only one that actually improved. So I wouldn't think that an overall soft employment picture is not consistent with overall business confidence moderating. What we're saying here, or what we're seeing here, and is being reported out of the construction sector is that it's one ray of hope out of an otherwise softening economic picture.
Absolutely. So let's talk about those risks too to this outlook, because we do know that the general economic performance remains weak, and at the same time, you also have a very uncertain global economic outlook. What's the biggest, in your view, risk to the continued recovery that we're seeing?
Well, I think the picture is a little bit nuanced, because if you look at what's happening in the construction sector, it's coming from such a low base that any improvement in activity tends to lead to a bit of an upswing in the actual numbers. But I would agree with you that the risks are that the South African economy slows down even more than anticipated, or if the global economy does not improve as we anticipate. However, I would counter that also by saying that if you look, for example, at what's happening in the fiscus, we are seeing, and it is being reported by the Treasury, that we're going to see fiscal consolidation. But within the overall budget, there's also an attempt to shift the expenditure side of the budget away from current expenditure to capital expenditure. So that should provide some continued support, particularly for non-residential contractors, which then tends to have a ripple effect to subcontractors and other parts of the building industry.
But Sizwe, we must be concerned because we have seen this money being provided for by the government. I think we've gone through several numbers, the trillions, the billions that government is continuously talking about in respect to infrastructure. And very little of that money has actually been seen in terms of balance sheets for companies going forward. How confident are you that we'll actually see some of that money, small but perhaps consistent, coming back into the building sector?
Well, I think the biggest constraint to that has been, up to now, the state's capacity to implement allocated budgets, particularly as they pertain to infrastructure. I think the only encouraging sign at the moment, if you listen, for example, to the rhetoric by Planning Minister Trevor Manuel, that out of the whole NDP, which is about 440 odd pages, he has been focusing a lot on the parts about improving state capacity. And I think those constraints to implementing budgets and spending capacity and infrastructure budgets hinge on that ability of the state to become more efficient.
Now, while I have you on the show, I must ask you, Sizwe, of course, we have seen a deterioration in the South African economic environment and also the global one. Have you had to change your numbers, your forecast for the rest of 2013 going into 2014?
Well, I think I was with you here about 2 weeks ago at the MPC speaking about the fact that, look, we started with a below consensus 2.4% GDP growth. The mere fact that we had 0.9 for Q1, I suggested that would lead to a downgrade in our GDP forecast, and we've followed through in terms of reducing our GDP forecast for 2013 to 1.9% and for 2014 to 3%.
And the risk to that even coming in lower?
Well, I think that the risks are now neutral. Because I get asked quite a lot in terms of where the growth drivers for 2014, for example, are. And I think that if you, for example, have a weaker exchange rate, we mustn't neglect the fact that exports and imports tend to react to a weaker exchange rate. So we could see some narrowing in the current account deficit into 2014.